Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning to everyone in the audience. This is the fourth CSIS event in a series of events on quantum technology, quantum computing. We are at a good time to talk about this. I'm told the National Security Council is about to issue a policy document on quantum. I don't know what's in it, but I've seen the paper at least. We've had a lot of talk here in Washington and in other capitals about a tech alliance where quantum plays a big role, and there's already agreement between the US and the UK. The European Union, European countries, China and the US are making major investments in quantum computing. So what we're going to talk about today is largely how do we get collaboration? How important is it? How do we get collaboration to work? And what are the benefits and obstacles? And as I was thinking about this, it says international collaboration, but you've also got collaboration with the private sector. So with that, we have three truly expert panelists who will each speak. Zaira Nazario is a quantum theorist at IBM Research. I'm not going to read their whole bios because they're overachievers and the bios are way too long, but I will read highlights. Quantum theorist, IBM Research, a principal research scientist. Prior to joining IBM's quantum theory team, she served as a consultant to DARPA and IARPA and was at the Department of State for a few years working on science policy. Andrew Houck is a professor electrical and computer engineering, Princeton University. He leads the Houck Lab and is deputy director of Brookhaven's National Laboratories Co-Design Center for Quantum Advantage. And he also chairs the Division of Quantum Information at the American Physical Society. So welcome. Finally, Travis Humble, interim director, U.S. Department of Energy Quantum Science Center at Oak Ridge National Laboratories. He's a distinguished scientist at Oak Ridge, directs the lab's Quantum Computing Institute, is an associate professor at the University of Tennessee, and associate editor for the Quantum Information Processing Journal. So this is kind of the dream team for us. We're very grateful for you coming and doing this. I will say for the audience, this is being recorded. You have the opportunity to submit questions on the web page that you're watching this on. There's a space for questions. Please feel free to do so. We'll get to questions in the final 10 or 15 minutes of the program. But with that, let me turn to our three speakers and ask them to make some opening remarks, about 5 minutes or so. Zaira, could I start with you?
Sure. Thank you, Jim. Well, I mean, it's great to be here today with you, with Andrew, Travis, and everyone that is joining us and watching to share some perspective and learn from all of you and from our discussion on this topic that is a really important one. So I can tell you, look, I think that the growth, and you alluded to this, of quantum computing, what we've been seeing in the past few years has been very impressive. I like to give you an idea, 6 years ago, that's when we put the first quantum computing device in the cloud, it was only 5 qubits back then. And it's not only that the technology has improved very, very fast, but that quantum computing has risen also to become a national strategic priority in many countries and have seen, like you said, growing levels of investment, both public and private. So to give you an idea, here's what we're seeing at IBM Quantum. We have almost 500,000 users that are running billions of circuits each day. There are over 180 members in our quantum networks worldwide that are exploring applications, millions of learners, tens of thousands of students that are competing for less than 100 internship slots. So really, like, the interest and pace of growth to me is astonishing. But the fact is that, quantum information technologies still require a lot of research and development at the foundational level. we still have a lot of technical problems to solve, and going about solving them alone is simply too slow. That's why we're here talking about collaborations, right? When we're talking about emerging technologies that have high potential, and given the global race to develop them that we're seeing, we simply can't afford slow. And the most efficient way of making fast progress is by uniting forces with partners, bringing to the table all the talent and creativity that we can gather. And also, let's be pragmatic about it. Talent, markets, technology investment, supply chains, these things are all internationally distributed. So that also highlights the importance of working with international partners. We at IBM believe that we should partner broadly and openly. This is what we have been doing through our quantum partnerships, through more strategic partnerships in Germany, Japan, in Canada, South Korea, where we have partnered to help grow regional ecosystems. From an industry perspective, I would say that partnering broadly is also important because you think about how you achieve rapid advance. That's through early use, through testing and feedback from as many people as possible. Also, those global partnerships help ensure growing a sustainable and stable value chain and supply chains that are so important for this industry. And it's also how we best drive technology adoption, which also opens international markets. I mentioned this before, but it also gives us access to the best talents around the world, which we need. The other thing, we should think about what are the things that we have learned about what works best when establishing these collaborations. And I'm sure we'll be talking more about this. But for example, we've learned that it's usually better to harness the power of local ecosystems, different from institution to institutional partnerships. That when building the framework for collaboration, whenever possible, we should support open source. Both open source software development, right? That's the spirit behind our SDK, Qiskit, and quantum computing software tools that are available to anyone and where community contributes to improvements, but also sharing information, sharing data where we can. It's very crucial that we support education and workforce development. And it's very important to engage and enable industry because the private sector there needs to have a certain level of commitment from them to adopt the technology to contribute to the different parts of the quantum computing stack, be it software or services or supply chains. These global partnerships don't work without government support. We'll talk about that more later, but they also don't work without academia and industry. So, and finally, the last thing I'm going to say is that something that I think is very important and that we take to heart is that it's essential that we have actionable goals and a roadmap with quantitative measure of output of impact, right? Like if we're putting resources here, what do they translate to? That's very important for us. And having a clear focus and understanding of where we're going, what is the long-term vision, what do we need to do to get there, how we measure success along the way and quantify as much as possible. And I'll stop here and we'll talk more over this hour.
Great, thank you. Those were tremendous opening remarks, and you raised a lot of good issues that we will come back to. But Andrew, let me turn to you for your remarks. You're muted.
Thank you, and thanks again for the invitation to join the panel. I want to start just by defining what we mean by quantum technology. So it's a little bit broader than quantum computing. Quantum technology encompasses using the sort of weird rules of quantum mechanics to do unprecedented things in computing, communication, and sensing. This will have a profound economic impact, so there's a race to win this for economic reasons, but there are also significant intersections with national security, which makes really understanding questions of international cooperation quite important. Quantum computers can solve problems that regular computers can't solve, which could really turbocharge a number of industries, but it could also have real implications for cryptography. Quantum sensing can help sense systems like biological systems, but it can also help things like doing GPS denied navigation, and quantum communication can give us provably secure communication. trying to understand how we build an international ecosystem where we can make the necessary scientific and technical advances while making sure that we don't expose ourselves to any national security risks. It is really a very delicate balance that we need to keep here. If quantum technology were about to explode and be ready for deployment, I think one might err a little bit on the side of caution. But quantum technology is so far in its infancy that we need a really high degree of collaboration to solve all of the problems. None of these domains of potential application are really ready for total deployment yet. And so I think there just are too many fundamental breakthroughs that need to happen and for us to have a sort of closed view of how we move forward. Now, collaboration and creating this collaboration can mean a number of different things. Quantum technologies bring us together in ways that we don't traditionally come together. We tend to organize along scientific disciplines as scientists, but quantum technology is a highly multidisciplinary field that goes from material science to devices up through computer architecture, algorithms, industrial engineering, and scaling. And this really requires collaboration across academic disciplines, between academia and national labs, which can usually support larger infrastructure projects that can't be done in an academic setting, and with industry, who can do the kind of scaled deployment that doesn't work in either an academic or national lab setting. In terms of international cooperation, not only do we need the ideas from abroad, we also need the best talent from abroad. Many of our scientists are not US-born scientists. If we lose that pipeline of the very best academic talent in the world and the very best industrial talent in the world, then we're really shooting ourselves in the foot. Our real sort of superpower in actually doing the world's best quantum science is our ability to attract the world's best people. Even beyond that, though, we need to think about issues of supply chain. If I think about my lab, we work on superconducting quantum computers. We grow our computers on absolutely pristine crystals. The very best crystals in the world right now are grown in Japan and Germany, so we need those. We cool things down to near absolute zero from a finished dilution refrigerator using helium-3, which is a byproduct of mining natural gas or sometimes nuclear weapons development. We use electronics that are sort of sourced from all over the world. We are sort of pulling together, but rely on semiconductor chips, which of course are mostly these days made in overseas foundries. And so the supply chain for supporting this quantum ecosystem and the specialty of materials is something that already is entirely global. And we can leverage each other's strengths and historical strengths in terms of what countries have excelled at and turbocharge this. But we also have to keep in mind that there's significant vulnerabilities there if we don't promote this kind of international cooperation. So that, I think, is my big picture is that, there are real national security questions that we have to address, but quantum computing and quantum information technology is too far in its infancy to err too far on the side of caution. We need the global pipeline of the very best talent in the world, and the global supply chain that supports this ecosystem is already global. And we need to make sure that we keep the international cooperation in order to keep the field going.
Thank you. That you probably tremble when you hear that the policy community is getting interested, because that usually means there'll be a fight over open versus closed. And I guess that's something to look forward to. But Travis, let me turn to you for the set of remarks, please.
Well, thank you, Jim. It's really a pleasure to be here, and of course to join my panelists to talk about this topic with you. Let me start off by first saying Happy World Quantum Day to everyone. This is actually the first April 14th, the first occasion of a new international emphasis on quantum science and technology known as World Quantum Day. And so I think it's a great opportunity to have this panel on the first occasion of this and to talk about this topic, because that emphasis on a global response to the opportunity that quantum science and technology represents, I think is very specific to what's happening at the moment. So within the United States, we've, of course, started a national quantum initiative. We've seen multiple initiatives happen across the world. Each of these is trying to develop the ideas of quantum science and technology and to take harness of what those opportunities may be, whether it's, advancing the state of computing or improving the state of sensors or securing communication networks. At Oak Ridge National Laboratory, we are actually taking a science-based approach to developing new types of materials, devices, and computing systems that could be used for exactly those purposes. For us, the priority is on scientific discovery and energy security. What are the new types of materials or new types of catalysts that we could develop if we only had access to better computing resources? Based on our experience, it's going to be through using quantum accelerated processing, things based on mixing quantum computing with our conventional technology. But that opens up a lot of questions that impact not just us, but around the world. As Andrew was emphasizing, you start to have these cascade effects in which an advance in computing may actually make new threats, new risk in your communication or public key infrastructure. So for those reasons, it's not so easy as just buckling down and doing the best science you can. There's a lot of other consequences to such a radical disruptive technology that have to be taken into account. For example, one of them relates to access to this technology. How do we ensure a fair and equitable access to such a radical transformative capability? Is it something that only the most powerful and privileged should have access to? Or should there be a principle that we actually ensure that it's available to everyone around the world? It's very early, but it's time to start thinking about those types of questions because it will ultimately form how the technology itself progresses. Similarly, of course, Oak Ridge National Laboratory is sponsored by the Department of Energy. We operate according to the scientific mission that drives us forward. But there's a lot of other concerns, especially around economic competitiveness, where this technology could have a big impact. And when you start talking about things related to import and export control or any types of licensings or regulations, I think that could inadvertently dampen the development of the technology if we too quickly try to tighten things down. So for that reason, I personally am very interested in the idea of open standardization of the methods and interfaces that are being developed right now, because again, it's early in the maturity of this technology. But we're about 20 years into the 21st century. My anticipation is that by the end of this century, quantum technology will abound in many different ways. And we need to think long-term in terms of how we want to manage that technology as well as the investments in the development of it. So the next 20 years may be a very fast growth period for developing quantum computers or sensors or networks. But once we reach that point, we've got to live with that. And so I think there's some consequences to how the technology needs to be distributed, disseminated, and then who has access to it and how we control that. But, and Zaira, I think, emphasized this in her opening remarks, the idea of bringing this technology together and developing it right now is globally dependent on collaborations, whether it's the supply chain. Andrew was emphasizing just how many different parts come from around the world to put one of these systems together, or it's the workforce development. The people who are the best in the world are trying to get together and work on these problems. How do we ensure that that continues to happen? It's not so easy as just hoping that everybody can make it work. It really is going to take a lot of deliberate thought and action, I think, on our parts.
Great, thank you. This gives us a lot to talk about. So I'll start by maybe asking, not the most positive question, but one that all of you sort of mentioned is, what are the barriers now, if any, to collaboration? Are there things we need to think about? And I'll tell you a little history here, which is in the Reagan administration. I don't even remember what year it was so long ago. There was a debate about whether to close off basic research and to deny it to international collaboration. And after an intense debate, the Reagan administration decided that it would serve our interests better to allow for open research, basic research, rather than close it off, even though there were strong proponents for tightening. And I wasn't in that debate, but I've been in 2 debates since then, not in this administration, I'm happy to say, but when you think about it, do you have barriers now that you face, or is it too early in the research for there to be much in the way of obstacles? They may come later, but right now, what's the situation?
Well, Jim, maybe I'll take the first crack at this. The standardization effort right now that is just getting started is one potential barrier. And what I mean by this is that whether it is driven by a consortium or driven by a single entity, the idea of standardizing a technology that's so early in its development could have unexpected, unintended consequences. In the sense, it may lock people into a certain way of developing or thinking about their technology that, ultimately slows down its growth. That can also, though, drive communities to not talk with each other because community A adopts one standard and community B another. And that could be across national borders, that could be across industry partnerships. So I do think that is an area right now that I'm keeping an eye on in terms of something that could stifle innovation, is that if we jump to it too quickly. But it's a double-edged sword because at the same time, in order to integrate together all these different areas of science and engineering, we do need some common language to tie people together. So we've got to walk that line very carefully.
Anyone else? No? Well, then let me touch on something Zaira raised, and actually all of you raised, which is you didn't say it, but there's something called quantum as a service, quantum computing as a service. And it's really kind of fun because it gives people access to quantum computing resources without actually having to have the actual device or all the things that Andrew was describing present there. But quantum as a service poses a question of who should have access to this service. How do we draw the line between, say, research in developing and improving quantum computing, quantum technologies, and actually just using it for serving on other problems? So Zaira, do you want to start with quantum as a service and what the implications are for collaboration?
Look, I think at this level, and this is something that both Andrew and Travis mentioned, right? It's about a balance, right? A balance on taking into account all those considerations that you raised, but keeping in mind the stage at which the technology is, right? And that it still needs involvement from a wider community to help develop it, right? Like we have to be careful because we want to protect things, but we don't want to slow the pace of progress either. And so having these, open environments and making it available to, a wider set of people, not just a handful of people in a lab or a handful of people with a lot of resources. It has the benefits of democratizing this technology. It has the benefit of bringing talent. We've all been emphasizing how important it is to have the best minds joined and helping us solve these challenges. I think at this level, it's that you get a lot of value from that. Maybe like later, as the technology develops further, you can consider, all those things. And I know, Travis, that you have been involved in some reports, looking at these issues and making recommendations around how to apply, well, not only like this type of protections, but, like you mentioned, who should have access, what types of lessons we can learn from the AI development and the ethics around AI and usage we can apply to quantum. So, maybe you can add more color here around that. But yeah, I mean, like you also have, you work with your partners. You make sure that you're working with partners that are, share the same principles of research integrity and reciprocity as you. I think like that's really important when you're talking about this type of access.
Travis, do you want to pick up on that?
Oh, sure thing. And thank you, Zaira, for calling this out. So this past January, the World Economic Forum released a guide to quantum computing governance principles. And this was, again, an international collaboration. I was fortunate enough to work with the IEEE and be part of that. But there were many other people represented on this writing team. And they hit on exactly on the topics that Zaira was talking about. And in fact, one of the great examples of this is the remote access that companies like IBM, as well as many others, are able to provide to people around the world to get just their hands on this technology, so to speak. And in that case, it is an emphasis on creating awareness about what is available today and what can be done with it, because it is a steep learning curve to understand exactly what the difference is between a quantum and conventional technology. And the best way to learn for a lot of people is to actually give it a try. So I think that this is a great example of how the current state of things is headed in the right direction. But there's many other issues that are going to have to be addressed over time. And this idea of democratizing that Zaira emphasized, I think is a great approach to that.
Well, Andrew, let me pick up on something you said. This is Washington, so we have to say the word China at least twice. And that is a topic that all of you have touched on, although indirectly, which is there's a huge debate over how much we should allow Chinese students to work in the US on research projects. There's a huge debate about collaboration and investment from the US to China. And having talked to some Chinese quantum researchers, I think they're having similar debates. So, Andrew, why don't we start with you? I mean, this is, in some ways, it's a workforce issue. In some way, it's the broader collaboration issue we're all talking about. But how do these? Yeah,
I think it's a really good question. I mean, I think, as a university, and I think as most U.S. universities, we have a very open spirit, right? We don't do research that basically any student at Princeton can't work on. And so I think it would really stifle the role that academics play in the development of a technology if we were to impose some kind of restrictions on which foreign nationals were able to work on these kinds of projects. I should say, we have really amazing Chinese students who want to come to the U.S. I think the real question that's a sort of more difficult question is, how can we find ways to keep Chinese students in the U.S. after they get their PhDs, and what's the right role for someone to play? I think, I definitely have a harder time placing Chinese students in U.S. industry than I do placing domestic students or even students from other countries. I think because of fears of corporate espionage or things like this. But there's sort of a number of places where we can use top talent that are not sort of on the most industrialized end of the quantum spectrum. And I think there are ways that we can create positions for people who come to the US for their degrees to stay in the US. And I think we're really squandering that talent when we make it difficult for people to stay. There are questions, right? I mean, I do think, at some point this technology might reach a point where we have to wonder, are there too many national security questions? I think at that point, it really has to become something that is no longer researched in academia, which means that we lose our entire pipeline of top students, not just international students, but also top domestic students, because this field can't thrive in an academic setting unless we have a fully open policy. And without sort of academics, we don't have this really incredible pipeline going to industry and the national labs. And so I think, right now we are so far away from this becoming a useful technology that could actually pose a threat, right? I think we had an announcement a year or two ago of the first thing that could plausibly be considered hard to do on a regular computer that was done on a quantum computer, but it can now be, relatively easily simulated on a classical computer now that classical computer scientists have thought about it for a while, right? That was a problem chosen specifically because it was hard to do on a regular computer. We don't have any examples of something useful someone could do on a quantum computer that can't be done on a classical computer with present technology, let alone something that could pose any kind of national security questions. So we are quite a long distance and many significant breakthroughs away from the point where this technology actually has immediate national security implications. So I think what we need to do first is to ensure that we have the policies in place, both to attract the top international talent and to keep US academics and domestic students excited about joining the field so that we can continue to sort of funnel our top people into solving these technical challenges.
That was really an interesting point. I'm not sure everyone in the national security community would agree. I think you're right, but I'm not sure everyone would agree that we're distant from the risk of some potential applications. But that's a good topic for us to talk about because it should shape the policy. But Zaira, Travis, let me see if you want to chime in on this China issue.
I think that Andrew did a great job explaining why it's to our look. U.S. academic openness gives us the ability to attract and recruit the best talent around the world. Andrew mentioned that, and I echo that. That is an advantage, and that is an advantage that we shouldn't lose. I think that as he said, right, like the important things is making sure that we have the right, policies and processes and all that in place so that we attract the best talent and we keep it here.
Travis, you're in a situation where you're dual-hatted, so you're at a university and you share all the things we've heard from Andrew and Zaira, but you're also at a national lab, so there might be a little tension there. What do you see on this issue?
Oh, Jim, yeah, great point. And I think there is, as Andrew was saying, a different role for different institutions within our science technology ecosystem. I absolutely agree that the academic freedom, the spirit of academic freedom is essential right now because there's so much discovery, innovation that's happening. If, just a little bit of anecdotal evidence, I run a newsletter for the laboratory where we post, the known jobs that are available right now for people in the field of quantum. And there's probably about 1,600 people subscribed to the newsletter. There's about 1,700 jobs in that posting. So there's enough for everybody right now to go out and get a new job. And what I'm trying to emphasize here is there is such a demand for this skill set that the idea of closing our borders to talent is not in our interest right now, either for the basic development of the technology or for the more sophisticated maturation of the technology towards these end user needs. Now, I do agree with what was said that the current devices today that we have access to are not known to pose a specific threat to security. But the technology is rapidly developing, and there's so much we don't understand about it that, at least for me, I think it exposes a potential risk. Not one that's been well defined yet, except to say that, well, if there were a breakthrough, how quickly would it take us to make a quantum computer that could rival our conventional supercomputers? And this is something that we monitor at Oak Ridge because, of course, we've got some of the world's fastest supercomputers here. And, it's getting close enough now that we have to keep checking. Whether it's a few days difference or a few years difference in speed, the fact is that we're able to measure that difference now. And that's an enormous change from where things were 10, 15 years ago. So the pace of the technology is developing so quickly, the potential for it to be disruptive is changing so quickly. But at the same time, there is this supply-demand issue when it comes to talent itself. So I don't have the solution on the policies that should be put in place to maintain the American economic competitiveness as well as our security, but I can definitely recognize the tension there.
I think it's one thing that's worth pointing out is that China has been building up on the infrastructure side quite quickly. And so they have the research infrastructure to absorb an enormous amount of talent. If we stop people from coming to the US, they're not going to stop doing quantum research. They're just going to do it for China's research ecosystem where that talent can be absorbed quite easily. So it's not a choice between sort of stopping people from doing quantum research or not. It's whether they do it here with some risk that they might leak information back to China, or do it directly for China with the enormous ecosystem that they have there. So I think it's important to remember that it's there's a choice there.
So that's really a relative risk question, which is something that drives a lot of policy. Is that there's no perfect solution. That's not going to be we're going to do all the quantum research and no one else will. But there are different approaches that have different risk portfolios. And if I'm hearing you right, what you're saying is it's better to take the risk of having people working here rather than to eliminate that risk and create a greater risk that they'll just go somewhere else and work. By the way, we've seen this movie before. In the 1950s, the US threw out Chinese rocket scientists, one of whom became the father of the Chinese space program. So perhaps that's a good example to bear in mind when we talk about leaving people out. But it did raise some questions here. We've talked about what the risks are of collaboration. What are the mechanisms that are good for collaboration? There's really a two-part question there. You have the traditional research community. What are the mechanisms for research community and private sector, research community and government? Are they different from what we've seen in the past? Does it change when you talk internationally? What should we be looking at as mechanisms for collaboration? That was such a long question that you can take some time to answer it. But so I've been in a number of these discussions with science advisors from other countries, and this is one of the fundamental issues: is what is the right mechanism for collaboration, international collaboration on quantum research?
So maybe I can start sharing some thoughts here, and then Andrew and Travis jump in. Look, Jim, there are two bodies that you mentioned in the promotion of this event that I think serves as good examples for this. One is the trilateral partnership between the US, UK, and Australia. There is a framework for collaboration that has been established there already. That it's about deepening information and technology sharing and collaborations in different areas. Some of the areas that they called in the partnership are AI and quantum technologies. So that's something that can be leveraged. You could think about expanding that to other countries as well. There is another one that you mentioned was the EU International Cooperation on Quantum Technologies. Right? And that is a 3-year study that was meant to do several things. One, identify win-win situations in terms of in what we collaborate with different countries. In that case was Europe, US, Japan, and Canada, right? And also design a roadmap to these international partnerships. So these are two bodies that can be leveraged. We can learn from the lessons of that study on the EU International Cooperation and see how we can leverage that. There is a very important example in the US, the Quantum Economic Development Consortium, right? And the NQI, which was established precisely to facilitate these types of growing collaborations, ensuring the impact of these collaborations, and growing the industry in quantum technologies. The QEDC is now opening up to international partners. They're starting with Australia, Canada, UK, New Zealand, the Nordic countries, Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Finland, Sweden, Japan. So I think that's a really good mechanism that we should all work to be sure that is successful, right? And then in terms of how to collaborate within those frameworks, I think that it's important to foster 4 essential areas: research and development that we talked about, educations and skills, and making sure that we're building a strong workforce that meets the demands of the industry and the technology and the ecosystem, building that industry ecosystem, and then providing adequate infrastructure and services that bring these technologies and bring access to these technologies to the partnerships, and that have a clear forward path for continuing the development of the technologies.
Great, thank you. Andrew, Travis.
I mean, I think building collaborations in science is one of the biggest challenges we face. I think it really is difficult to get people to work together in meaningful ways, even if they are down the hall from each other at a single university, right? We all have our own style. I'm directing one of the 5 NQI centers, and what we've really been working there is trying to find how to build teams of people in different types of institutions, in different types of universities, but also at IBM and at Brookhaven National Lab and at Pacific Northwest National Lab, and really to try and figure out what types of research each institution is particularly good at, because the sort of research culture, the infrastructure of a place really dictates what can be done there. And I think as we think internationally, the same kind of view can be quite important, right? Because different countries have invested in different areas of strength, and they can bring very different things to the table. And I think as we start to think about trying to bring quantum technology to fruition, really trying to figure out what are the different strengths of different countries and how can you build an actual constructive research collaborative framework out of those pieces is something that I think is extremely important. Now, obviously, from a policy point of view, that requires having relatively few barriers and the mechanisms to actually have those conversations to find where those collaborations are. But I think really trying to focus on what are different international partners good at, and how can we bring that together to sort of accelerate the whole field is something that I think is really critical for this.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, if I can follow up on both of these excellent points, the national initiatives, I think, and of course the InQI within the United States has led to these multiple focal points for interaction. The National Quantum Information Science Research Centers, the Quantum Economic Development Consortium, all of these, I think, have played a pivotal role in defining the American presence on this topic. Of course, there are other initiatives happening in Europe and Asia, around the world, that are similarly defining national presence as well. And it feels at some point that this is kind of tried to regionalize the issue, that individual countries are making their stake, but it's these partnership agreements that Zaira was mentioning that are actually preventing those walls from coming up in the first place, right? There are conduits in place to enable exchange of research and technologies across borders that are actually really important to going back to our earlier discussion about not stifling innovation. But there's always going to be this tension about, well, how much do I need to give away? And I'm not sure yet that we understand what the answer to that question is. The science-first approach enables us to focus on open innovation and publishing and disseminating results around the world. But at some point, these technologies do become intellectual property, and they start to become protected, and they start to become restricted in their access. And right now, while the market is trying to find its feet and stand up these ideas and eventually turn them into useful components of our ecosystem, I think it's a very delicate, fragile period, and we need to make sure that we emphasize those partnership agreements and ensuring that these national focal points stay open.
I think
go ahead, Zaira.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Travis, that you raised. It is that, look, like it's as simple as if innovators are not confident that they'll have the protections that they need for their ideas, like they will be less open to collaborate. So it's that balance where, and that this is especially important for small businesses and startups that need that pretty much to survive. So in building these collaborations, it is important to have that strong, reliable, simple and fair system of IP, right? Like where all the parties involved, have that comfort that to be able to share whatever innovations that they are willing to share with their research partners, and have that trust, build the trust. And one last thing that I would mention is emphasizing the important role of government. We are at very early stage in this technology. And so small businesses, startups that are getting involved here really need the help, the support of government to help them subsidize the risk, right? And be able, so that they're able to thrive and help with the supply chain issues that Andrew mentioned at the beginning as well.
Yeah, just having been in a couple of these negotiations, I'll say the closer you get to commercialization, the more difficult it becomes. And in one negotiation, the actual agreement took 6 months. The agreement on who owned the IP that was produced took 2 years. So something to look forward to. Maybe it's good we're at an early stage. And I think that's the open source question as well, which is how much of this can be done in the coding for quantum is very different. How much of it should be done open source? How much of it should be proprietary? Is that a useful line to think about here? And in an initial stage, open source might be the way to go, but what would be the indicators you might want to shift focus there? So I don't know who wants to start with that one. Andrew?
I mean, I'm a part of an open source project right now out of Fermilab with a professor at the University of Chicago as well, that's trying to open source the development of the control hardware for quantum computing, because the cost per channel was much too high. This, I think, is changing the way we do research in our group, and a number of the groups are starting to adopt this. I think, before this, I think many other groups have sort of individually been doing their own sort of control electronics versions, but it's essentially just everybody duplicating the same kind of effort. And in these early stages, having 400 people individually do the same thing and have it be not quite that reliable is nowhere near as good as trying to sort of collectively come together and decide on what we want and how we can bring down both the cost and bring up the quality. At some point, that will shift, and I think the place where that will shift is really in industry and in companies, right? Because I think they have a sense of which parts of their developments are actually valuable and where they could benefit from having many more people join in and aid in the development, right? And so I think as you move closer and closer towards something having commercial value, then I think things start to become more proprietary. But right now, we're at a place where the commercial value isn't there yet, and the ability to get an entire community working together to make something good is just a clear win.
Travis, how much does open source figure in what you do at the National Lab? I mean, is that?
So we actually support a program at the Oak Ridge Leadership Computing Facility, which is located at the National Laboratory, called the Quantum Computing User Program. And this program is open to international applicants to gain access to commercial quantum computing systems that we've gone out and purchased subscription to. IBM's actually one of our hottest commodities. Being able to provide the access to the IBM quantum processors is something that many people come to Oak Ridge in order to be able to run their programs on, test out their ideas. But here's the point. The caveat to the program is that what we are looking for is for people to publish their results, because we're using that program, that openness of the program, to monitor progress in the technology. We may get 20 people who want to try testing chemistry as an application on a quantum computer. And each one of them is going to take a slightly different approach, and some of them are going to succeed where others don't. And so that's an incredibly useful indicator to us on the progress in the technology and eventually to forecasting when it may reach a level of readiness for us to think of production. But so right now, most of that research is what we call pre-competitive. It is just feeling out proof of concept demonstrations, and getting access to the hardware is something that at least we can facilitate. And then the results that we're seeing are incredibly useful for predicting how things are unfolding.
Well, I thought I wasn't going to do this, but I can't resist. It's too good an opportunity to pass up. So I think I mentioned that I've talked to Chinese quantum researchers, and my impression was they're the real deal, right? They're not, sometimes the Chinese say they're doing stuff and it's fake and sometimes or exaggerated. I didn't get that impression in talking to some of them, and I can tell you who they were later. But off the top of your head, if you were going to go around the world and rank centers of research strength in quantum, what countries would be on your list? I can do this for AI, I can do this for semiconductors. What would you do for quantum? Who do you look to when you think of foreign partners?
I think Canada and Australia are two very good examples, right? That have been in the field for a very long time and have built a lot of expertise and skills there.
And these are universities, not so much government-supported efforts. Good. That's easy. Go ahead, Andrew.
So I would say I'm gonna make some enemies here. I would say Canada, Australia, Japan, China, Switzerland, the Netherlands, the UK, Germany, France are sort of the places where I think there are really quite excellent quantum centers and people that I talk to regularly or find that are doing really quite exceptional work.
Yeah, I agree.
I would certainly buy into everything that's been said. I'm going to play it safe and not give my own list. I am going to say I will add the United States because I think it may be an obvious choice, but we really are at the forefront of this technology. But there are very many peers that are close in their sophistication and development. And some of that goes back to the infrastructure, how much they are investing in science and technology at the country level as a whole, right? Because what we're finding is that quantum is actually a technology that integrates together many different areas. So you need a very good microelectronics industry. You need a very good materials industry. You need a very good supply chain. So for all of these reasons, the problem itself isn't just how much investment is in quantum, it's how much investment is in these other areas as well. So certainly I think there's a lot of near peers for the United States in this topic.
Yeah, and one of the reasons we're having this event is because many of the countries, not all, but most of the countries, in fact, that you mentioned are allies and security partners. And so the question now is how do we come up with an effective mechanism for this collaboration, which there's been an AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US agreement is a good example, but all of these are at a very early stage. We've gotten a couple questions from the audience. Let me ask them. Actually, we're getting more. This always happens. You come to the end of the program and people start to send in questions. But we'll see how many we can get through. The first one, it's from an Asian embassy here in Washington. I'll just read it. Quantum computing is crucial. Some people worry about the maturity of the technology and the coming of a quantum winter, and they cite AI as an example of that. What do you think of the fear or the risk of a quantum winter?
I think that it's all about managing expectations, right? Like being very honest about where we are with the technology, what we need to do to get to the finish line. And as long as we keep that discipline and we keep working together and accelerating as much as we can the progress, but keeping that, being very clear about where we are and where we have to go. I don't think I think we can avoid that.
I think probably the hype around quantum technology has gotten overheated in the short term, but not in the long term. But I think, with steady, and it's important to be steady and consistent large scale government support, we can weather any kind of quantum winter, right? So if we believe that the long term value of quantum computing is worth it, then the short term ups and downs of the hype cycle won't matter nearly as much.
That is very important. I like that. The steady continuous support from government, because we're here for the long run, and that's critical. Government, the role of government as a catalyst for all this, to have successful technology development, and the understanding that this has to be a multi-year commitment.
Definitely managing expectations is the key to this. When you first hear about quantum and you hear about how disruptive it could be, there's a very reactive response to, that eventually ebbs with time as you get to know the technology better and you understand the state of it. The continued development, though, and the continued progress that we're seeing gives me hope that we'll dodge any severe winter, maybe a light chill or an early frost, but hopefully we'll stay in the springtime of quantum for years to come.
Yeah, part of my job here is to go around and pop the balloon of the hype cycle. So it's definitely something. We're getting a few more questions. Someone brought up supply chain. What do you consider the biggest threats to the viability of supply chains for quantum technologies? They're looking particularly at some of the barriers to exporting components or know-how. And I know this is under discussion within the Department of Commerce and other places. So what are the risks to the supply chain that we're looking at?
So one thing I've noticed is that just some of the raw materials that go into the development of the individual components. So not the integration of these pieces, but one example here is helium. Helium-3 is actually a very rare commodity, highly used within many of the quantum technologies. And so finding good, reliable sources of that is actually an incredibly important piece of the supply chain there. But there's other materials as well. And if there is a global disruption, war in Eastern Europe, or export control from other countries as well, all of that could lead to slowdowns and bigger supply chain issues. I will say that we have noticed that the global supply chain delays right now are also impacting equipment for quantum and other things. So it cascades into this area too.
Great. Andrew, Zaira, want to add anything?
I don't think there's anything catastrophic, but it certainly changes the pace of research. And in a hot field where you're trying to stay on the top, having 6-month, 12-month delays here or there really does impede the pace of research. So
this question, don't take it the wrong way. I'm just going to read it. It says, how do you think leadership training for those who run research centers or similar organizations could be improved to help them lead better and achieve more impactful innovation? I see that as a compliment, but I maybe you guys can have some views on that. I almost didn't read it, but I figured, Anyone?
Hey, Jim, yes. I think in the context of this conversation, certainly awareness of the global influence that this technology has on, not just policymakers and the stakeholders here, but also, how you need to manage those types of programs. If for example, nationality is a concern for your workforce, you need people who are paying attention to this. At Oak Ridge, we actually have people dedicated to our personnel access, and so that's an incredibly important part, I think, for something that's changing so quickly and getting so much attention. I won't say that they've got a lot of college courses on this topic right now, but that's certainly something you could see in the future.
Very nicely said, Travis. And I think, look, like, at least some basic understanding of the technologies definitely helps. And it's something that, it's part of the whole skill development part that goes with growing the field.
Andrew, any reaction from you? No.
I mean, it's an interesting idea to have some kind of leadership training for folks. I mean, obviously, in a research community, you tend to rise to positions of leadership based on research excellence, and that is maybe not orthogonal to being able to sort of build a community, but it's certainly not the same skill set. So trying to think about ways to help people as they, right now it's sort of on the job training. You lead larger and larger things until you can't keep up, and then everything falls apart. So having some kind of formal training is not a terrible idea, but I don't know what form that would take to be effective.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because you see that in a lot of fields where it's your performance that gets you promoted, and then you need a whole different skill set. But we got one final question. I think we've touched on it, because it asks, the Commerce Department, as you know, is looking at export controls for quantum technologies. And we've talked about this on and off throughout the conversation. Any final words on what Commerce should do as they move forward on regulation? And I take the point on openness, but any other suggestions?
I think we've mentioned this during this hour of conversation, both the importance of recognizing the need to balance, that need to ensure that we have technological leadership and commercial leadership in these technologies, with the protection of national security interests, especially because of the potential impact that we're talking about, because of the pace of progress that we're seeing and the level of global activities, right? But I think that when we talk about these types of policies to address that balance and those regulations and so on, I've said it before, so I'm going to emphasize it because it's really important. It has to be done in a way that, yes, it does protect, but it does not slow the pace of progress of the US quantum computing industry.
Travis, Andrew, any advice for Commerce? No.
Yeah. Oh, sure. No, definitely.
I will say that I feel like we have always had export control, in the sense that maybe no license is required for a particular technology. It's still within that framework. The question here, though, is should there be certain technologies or ideas, capabilities that do need licenses to go outside the United States, or even bring them in? And I think that we will find, as the technology develops, as quantum computers become more powerful, or quantum encryption becomes, more widespread, that we'll see these types of regulations being applied. And I think that's fine, because this goes back to the point that, we have to be in the national interest. But it needs to not be reactive. It needs to be based on specific, credible concerns about what that technology will do, and not I heard from somebody on a panel discussion that quantum computing can crack cryptography. It's got to be much more reasoned than that, because exactly what Zaira was saying, we have to be able to anticipate and forecast how it's going to develop over time, and then react to that in terms of the development of the entire structure.
Great, thank you.
Consider basing that based on the timelines and the requirements that would be needed by relevant practical applications. Could be a way of addressing that.
Any final remarks? If not, we're at the hour. Let me congratulate the panel on not using the word entanglement, which is now becoming highly favored in the political science community. So we managed to get through a whole hour without saying any of the entanglement. But we had a great discussion of risk, and I think this is one of the things that looms over the idea of collaboration. You all emphasize the importance of openness. We've certainly learned that in other technological advances, that an open system produces better than a closed one. And one other interesting point, there are many, but one other interesting point that I wrote down twice is the maturity of the technology, and it's easy to overestimate how mature it is. And that has implications for risk. So Zaira, Andrew, Travis, thank you very much for doing this. It was a great panel.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Travis. Thanks, Andrew.